Good day. Today is Friday, 27th December, and the first thing I must do is to thank all of those people who have written kind and very generous words of thanks and Christmas greetings to me and to my family on the occasion of the Christmas holiday. I've been deeply moved and very affected by these words, and the number of them, as, by the way, has my wife. May I say again, thank you all of you who did that. Now, of course, in the last 2 days during the holiday, lots of things have continued to happen around the world. And it's important to mention that though I and my family, as Greek, well, in my case, Greek Orthodox person, I celebrate Christmas on 25th December according to the Western Gregorian calendar. Russian Orthodox Christians do not do so. They celebrate Christmas on 25th December according to the older Julian calendar, which makes for Christmas being celebrated in Russia on what, according to the Western calendar, is the 7th of January. So the Russians have not yet celebrated Christmas. I mention this because in connection with the missile strike that took place on Christmas Day, the Christmas Day that I and my family celebrated, and I'm sure most of you celebrated, a lot of people mentioned the fact that this was an attack carried out on Christmas Day. Zelensky himself in Ukraine said that this missile strike took place on Christmas Day. But of course, the Russians do not celebrate Christmas on that day. And until the Ukrainians themselves, the Ukrainian authorities, started to shift the dates, which has only happened, as I understand it, over the course of the last year. Ukrainians have not celebrated Christmas, or at least most Ukrainians have not celebrated Christmas on that day either. I'm going to make a guess that a very, very large majority of Ukrainians, or at least maybe not a majority, a very large number of Ukrainians who still adhere to the canonical Russian Orthodox Church, are also going to celebrate Christmas on what Westerners call the 7th of January. Anyway, enough about dates. Let's move on and discuss the other important things that have been taking place. And in this program, I'm going to focus again on the situation, on the conflict in Ukraine. It's not that lots of things aren't happening in other places, but Ukraine, in my opinion, continues to be the most important conflict, certainly the most important geopolitical conflict. And here, it's worth saying that we have actually seen a certain amount of movement on the diplomatic front over the course of the last week. Perhaps the single most important event that has taken place, or at least public announcement that has taken place, is Donald Trump's comment, which I discussed in my last video 2 days ago, that he actually does want a summit meeting with Vladimir Putin, and that summit meeting is going to take place after he becomes president of the United States. Well, the Russians, and this is pure chance, I don't think that they were expecting Trump to say that, but the Russians over the last couple of days have been continuing with their campaign to make absolutely clear what they will expect to come out of any negotiations, what they're prepared to concede, or where they might be prepared to make concessions, and where they're not prepared to make concessions. And it is fair to say that the Russian position overall remains full square with what Putin said it would be when he addressed the Foreign Ministry Board back in June. He set out what I have referred to as Istanbul Plus. I want to make it clear, by the way, because I've seen certain other places start to refer to the Russian position as Istanbul Plus. I want to stress that no Russian official that I'm aware of has ever used the expression Istanbul Plus. It is entirely my invention. But anyway, I will continue to use it. What Putin set out in June, what I call Istanbul Plus, is actually a very straightforward statement of position. Firstly, the settlement must include an agreement whereby Ukraine reverts to neutral status, abandons once and for all any idea of joining NATO, where the territorial realities, as the Russians say, are recognized, which means that the four regions are accepted as part of Russia, and that Ukraine withdraw completely from all territory within the four regions which it still controls. That Crimea obviously also remains part of Russia, and where perhaps after these two steps have been taken, after Ukraine has publicly confirmed that it is not going to join NATO now or ever, and after the Ukrainian troops have withdrawn from the four regions, then there can be a ceasefire, at which point there are many, many points that remain to be discussed and agreed on the size of Ukraine's armed forces, or whatever security guarantees Ukraine, and by the way, Russia should receive, and from whom, at the end of the conflict, about the position of Russian speakers in Ukraine, about the position of the Russian Orthodox Church, about the size of Ukraine's armed forces. All of those things will need to be discussed, but the starting point in relation to each one of them will be that which was agreed by Ukraine in Istanbul in April 2022. The Russians might have a few things that they want to add or discuss on top of that, but Putin has said that Istanbul must remain the starting point of those discussions. On this, of course, there may be some elements of flexibility. The Russians, for example, might be prepared to compromise on some issues about the Russian language, difficult though I suspect that would be. But anyway, that for the moment remains the Russian position. And the question of NATO membership and of the four regions, well, that is not something that the Russians are prepared to compromise on. Now, a sequence of Russian officials have come out and have discussed all of this over the last couple of days. And the sequence began with Valentina Matviyenko, who is the head of the chair of the upper house of Russia's parliament, the Federation Council. Now, Matviyenko never gets the attention in the West that she should. I get the sense that Western commentators and analysts and politicians don't take her especially seriously. I don't think many of them have ever met her, and I don't think they have any very clear views about her. And I think that is a mistake myself. Matviyenko is a full member of Russia's Security Council, its top decision-making body. She is obviously the head of the Federation Council, which is one of the houses of the Russian parliament. She has also been a former governor of St. Petersburg, which was Putin's home and birth city. She is known to be very close to Putin. In fact, she spoke with Putin. She had a meeting with Putin, which was broadcast on state television just a few days before she made the comments I'm about to make. And she's conducted significant diplomatic work on behalf of Russia, principally in the Middle East. So in my opinion, she's a rather more important person than people acknowledge. But anyway, whatever, this is what she said. She said that certainly the negotiations process will begin next year without any doubt, but in my opinion, it will be very complex. No doubt one must seek compromises in any talks, but with a strict observance of the main terms voiced by Russia. And Istanbul agreements that were undermined had the foundation, the basis of our approaches. I'm not going to reiterate them. She's talking, by the way, to TASS, to the Russian TASS news agency. I'm not going to reiterate them. You know them perfectly well. Now, this is the constant element. We will not yield on this one bit. We are ready to sit down at the negotiating table at any moment, but what we went through with the Minsk agreement won't be repeated. So the Russians will not be strung along again, as they were after the Minsk agreement was agreed in February 2015. That set out a pathway towards peace in Ukraine. There was a whole series of steps that each side, that the Ukrainians principally needed to take. The Donbass republics also needed to take certain steps. Ukraine mostly needed to take certain steps, all culminating, as I remember, in elections and a new constitution for Ukraine, which was supposed to take place by the end of 2015. The Minsk agreement was never implemented. The Ukrainians, as they have straightforwardly admitted, never had any intention of implementing the Minsk agreement. The president who signed the Minsk agreement on behalf of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, has acknowledged as much. Zelensky himself, at one point when he was elected, said that he did want to implement the Minsk agreement. He was threatened. You can find a film of it, by the Azov brigade if he went ahead with it, and eventually he didn't. And he has since, on several occasions, said that he also had no intention of implementing the Minsk agreement. Whether that's true, I'm not going to say, but the fact is that that is his position. That's the position he's taking now. And Western political leaders, Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, they've made it fairly clear that they were aware that the Ukrainians were sabotaging the Minsk agreement, and they let the Ukrainians do it. They allowed that to happen. So the Russians are not going to go back there again. Anyway, that is Matviyenko. But of course, what she said is overshadowed by what other, more important, more senior Russian officials to her have also been saying. And two of them in particular have been speaking extensively over the last couple of days since I made my last video. And arguably they are the two most important Russians in discussing foreign policy issues. One is Putin himself, the other is Sergei Lavrov. Now, I'm going to start with Putin because Lavrov's interview, he gave an interview, actually more like a press conference, in which he's discussed Russian policy with several journalists. But Putin's words are much shorter and briefer. He made them in what looks like an impromptu press conference, which took place following a meeting of the Supreme Eurasian Economic Council. So these comments were made yesterday. And he made a number of very interesting points about the possible negotiations to end the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to begin with a question that was put to him by Zarubin, who is Putin's and the Kremlin's favored Russian journalist. He's the man who conducts most of the interviews with Putin. And Zarubin's question was as follows. We are increasingly hearing statements and speculations from abroad, both from political scientists and from officials, that the conflict in Ukraine could be ended as early as next year, and everyone is wondering how. And in Trump's team, they are speculating. And then there was a brief interjection from Putin, which I'm going to jump. And then Zarubin goes on to say, and Trump's team is saying and directly stating that the conflict can be frozen on the condition of a guaranteed delay of 10 to 20 years from Ukraine's entry into NATO. How do you like this formula? Now, this, of course, comes from the Kellogg report of April, written, as I've said, during the presidential election in the United States and in the context of that election. And Kellogg and Feitz did say that some kind of negotiation between the United States and Russia should be initiated to try to bring the war to an end. And within the body of the report, there was this suggestion that the United States offer to postpone NATO membership for Ukraine for 10 to 20 years, though, as I have pointed out, and though very few people have noticed, this was a suggestion that Kellogg and Feitz were making in the report, not to President Trump, but to the existing president, to the president who was then in office, who was in fact President Biden. And that is particularly interesting in light of what Putin said in response to this proposal, this suggestion that Ukraine's NATO membership be postponed for 10 to 20 years. And anyway, Zarubin made the point that I've just said, and then Putin shot back and says, and who says so? And then Zarubin came back and said, in the Trump administration, there are also discussions with reference to the special envoy, that's obviously Kellogg, for the Ukraine crisis on this matter. Now, this is obviously a planted question. And then Putin responded, I see. I don't know what they're saying now in the team of the elected president of the United States. I know that the current president, Biden, told me about this. It's no secret, back in 2021. He suggested exactly this to me, to postpone Ukraine's admission to NATO for 10 to 15 years because it's not ready now. So if we go back to the Kellogg-Feitz report, Kellogg and Feitz were suggesting then that Biden proposed to Putin that in order to end the war, that Ukraine's entry into NATO be postponed by 10 to 20 years, apparently unaware that Biden had already made that very proposal to Putin in the weeks before the start of the conflict. And Putin, at that point, rejected it outright, as he has just reminded us. This is what he went on to say. To which I reasonably replied, well, yes, it is not ready today, but you will prepare it and accept it. In terms of historical distances and timeframes, this is a moment. What difference does it make to us today, tomorrow, or in 10 years? I am not familiar with these statements by the future team of the elected president, but if this is so, then what is the difference between the current administration and the proposals you just mentioned? There is no difference. I don't know how this situation will develop further and what the instructions from the president-elect to his colleagues in the administration will be. We'll see. So, Putin is shooting this proposal down. The Russians are not prepared to accept a postponement of NATO entry for Ukraine for 1 year, for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15 years. Any time frame is unacceptable, however extended it might be. The issue is not whether Ukraine's membership is postponed. For the Russians, the issue is whether it takes place at all. And Putin has made it absolutely clear in these comments, and I have to say they are so strong and so categorical that I think it is inconceivable, personally, that he will walk them back. These are not the kind of words that a politician makes when he thinks or intends at some point over the course of a negotiation to walk them back. Anyway, I think that these statements make it absolutely clear that this idea, the idea that Biden proposed in 2021, the idea that Kellogg and Feitz, again, publicly suggested that Biden take up in April of this year, and which is now being suggested that Trump also take up, the idea of postponing NATO entry by 10, 15, 20 years. Putin is making it absolutely clear that it is, for him, for the Russians, completely unacceptable. This idea will not fly. And anyway, Putin had an awful lot more to say. There's a relatively short press conference by his standards. He was talking a lot about the events in Kursk Oblast. He said much more about the Oreshnik, the deployment of the Oreshnik missile in Belarus. He talked about economic conditions in Russia, about which he was generally positive. He also said that he is kept fully briefed about military developments on the battle lines. And then he was asked whether he expects victory, what he expects to happen in 2025. And he was asked, what do you believe? Do you believe that in 2025 the conflict will end naturally with our victory? And Putin replied, I believe in God, and God is with us. What else? And then there was a very interesting discussion by Putin of his meeting with Fico. Now, I should say, in previous programs that I've done on this channel, I've discussed Fico's visit to Moscow. I have said that, in my opinion, the stated purpose of the visit, which was to discuss energy matters, could not have been the main topic of discussion. Clearly, the main topic of discussion between Fico and Putin was the oncoming negotiations with the Americans to try to find some way to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. And I said in previous programs, and we also discussed on the Duran, that the purpose of Fico's visit was to establish another line of contact between the Americans and between the Russians and the Trump team. One had been established by Prime Minister Orban of Hungary. Orban, for various reasons, is in a difficult position travelling to Moscow, having only fairly recently been there and having only fairly recently spoken to Putin. Sending to Fico to go to Moscow therefore widens the number of European leaders engaged in these discussions. It takes some of the focus away from Orban, shifts it to Fico. But we should see these actions by Orban and Fico as clearly coordinated and most probably coordinated with the Trump team. Now, I have to say, I came in for some criticism about these speculations, and I accept that they were speculations. Some people were not happy, and I noticed that there were some attempts, shall we say, to limit circulation of my particular musings on this. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that. Suffice to say that Putin has now come forward and he has confirmed that my speculations were largely, shall we say, essentially true. He said this: as a rule, we do not make public what we talk about unless we agree to tell the press that we agree. But I think that Mr. Fico will not be offended by me. Yes, indeed. He said that if the negotiations are about a peaceful settlement, and I want to emphasize that Mr. Fico, I don't know, he may have some squabbles with the current Ukrainian leadership, with someone else in the European Union. Somehow not everything is going well in terms of mutual understanding, but he first and foremost spoke about a peaceful settlement in the Ukrainian situation. He, as they say, was pushing this. So I don't know what claims Europe or anyone else may have against him, but this is exactly what he spoke about. This is what he focused his attention on. That was about the negotiations. And it turns out that Fico offered Slovakia, Bratislava, as a possible venue for discussions. Yet regarding the venue, yes, he said that if it comes to negotiations, they would be happy to provide his country as a venue for such negotiations. And we are not against it if it comes to that, because Slovakia is neutral. From our point of view, its position is neutral, and this is an acceptable option for us. So that is what Fico and Putin discussed. They discussed negotiations, they discussed a way forward for negotiations, they discussed the possibility of Slovakia becoming a venue for future negotiations. So there it is. That's the nature of Putin's discussions with Fico. They were indeed mostly about the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I'm just going to finish my discussion of Putin's press conference by coming to the very last question that he was asked, which was about Slovakia, about Moldova, to be more precise. The Russian intelligence agency, the SVR, has published a report that the new president, or rather the President Maria Sandu of Moldova, who has just been confirmed in office, that she might actually launch some kind of military attack on Transnistria to seize a power station or power complex there. Moldova is going through a major energy crisis because of, again, this perennial problem of transfers or supplies of gas to Moldova. So the SVR talks about a potential military crisis, political crisis in Moldova. And Putin was asked this question by a journalist from Izvestia, a Russian newspaper. Vladimir Vladimirovich, that's Putin's name and patronymic. The Foreign Intelligence Service reported at the beginning of the week that, and then Putin was cut in, don't scare us. And then Ivanov said, this is the journalist from Izvestia. The SVR reported that Moldova could become a new hotspot on the map. The foreign ministry said the day before that there would be an attempt to destabilize the situation in Belarus, naturally with the help of the West. Perhaps it is a naive question. What needs to be done to stop these attempts to set our borders on fire? And Putin simply responded, be strong. Happy New Year. All the best. Goodbye. So there we go. That was how this press conference ended. I suspect that the purpose of the press conference was to give Putin an opportunity to set out clearly his position about Ukraine's possible NATO entry. Zarubin, who is the journalist who asked the relevant question, is somebody, as I said, particularly close to Putin. He comes across to me as, in effect, a member of Putin's team, semi-detached member of Putin's team. This issue, this topic, was not brought up in the previous Q&A that Putin did last week. So there was a need to tie up that loose end, and that's why this impromptu news conference was arranged. And Putin has made it absolutely clear that NATO entry for Ukraine now or at any point in the future, as far as the Russians are concerned, is off the table. It is not something that they are prepared to talk about or negotiate about or compromise on. And I think that we need to take them at their word on this. I think it would be a huge mistake not to do so. Anyway, that is Putin. As I said, he spoke briefly, but very much to the point. Lavrov, who was talking on the same day as Putin, spoke at much greater length. It was a huge interview which he gave to Russian and international news media yesterday. And he was asked all sorts of questions. And again, most of them focused very much on the prospects of peace, or at least a negotiated outcome to the conflict in Ukraine. And he was asked specifically about the appointment of Kellogg and about the possibilities of agreeing a ceasefire. And this is what Lavrov said. Empty talk is not an option for us. I'm taking this, by the way, from the Foreign Ministry's website, and it is their translation. Empty talk is not an option for us. Everything we have heard so far is rhetoric about the need to come up with some kind of ceasefire. However, not much is done to hide the fact that the purpose of this ceasefire is simply to buy time, to flood Ukraine with more weapons, help it get back in shape, to carry out additional mobilization, and so on. Ceasefire is a road leading nowhere. We need binding legal agreements that will lay out the conditions for ensuring Russia's security and the legitimate security interests of our neighbours. Now, the last could include Ukraine, just saying. However, they should exist in an international legal context that would preclude chances of violating these agreements. These agreements must address Ukraine's the root causes of the Ukraine crisis. The two main ones include, first, the violation of the commitment not to expand NATO to the east, and the aggressive absorption by NATO of the geopolitical space all the way up to our borders. This is what they had in store for Ukraine. They keep talking about it to this day. The second root cause includes the Kiev regime's absolutely impossible actions following the coup. The elimination of everything Russian, including language, mass media, culture, and even the use of the Russian language in everyday life, officially green-lighted and then codified into law. Of course, that includes outlawing the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And then Lavrov went on to say, we are told that Russia is allegedly putting forward preliminary conditions. These are not preconditions, but in demands to act in line with previous agreements. As it turned out, they lied to us when they assured us that NATO would not expand eastwards. They lied to us when they emphasized their commitment to a settlement based on the UN Charter. And then he goes into a discussion about that. He then goes on to say that for the Russians, another temporary agreement on the lines of Minsk is completely unacceptable. And then talking about Kellogg, he says this. You mentioned Keith Kellogg, who was announced President Trump's special envoy for Ukraine. He recently stated that they had seen an attempt by Russia and Ukraine to reach an agreement within the framework of the Minsk process, which failed. So let's not repeat it, he said. Of course, Mr. Kellogg has yet to delve deeper into the Ukraine file. By the way, Kellogg did say that. He said that there should not be a failed process like the Minsk process, and that needs to be avoided. And Lavrov says he should delve deeper into the Minsk process. The Minsk agreements were not an attempt, but a duly signed documents guaranteed by an additional declaration made by the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, which said that Euro-Atlantic security would take into account the interests of all countries and that efforts to create a common space from the Atlantic to the Pacific would be revived. It said a lot of things, and he also points out that the Minsk agreement was confirmed and enshrined in a resolution of the UN Security Council, and that President Poroshenko, who signed the document on behalf of Ukraine, and former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President François Hollande admitted 2 years ago that despite all of this, the Ukrainians were not going to act upon the Minsk agreement. They simply needed time to flood Ukraine with weapons. These same ideas remain floating in the air, but they are much less binding than the Minsk agreement. They pursue the same goal, which is to buy time for the regime. As President Putin said, we are willing to consider serious and concrete proposals. It is probably too early to speculate and to guess. I hope that the Trump administration, including Mr. Kellogg, will look into the root causes of the conflict. We remain open to consultations. If someone finds it hard to understand where we stand, even though we have made it clear on many occasions, we are ready to reiterate our position. We are open to talks if they focus on the substance and the root causes and the principles mentioned by President Putin in his speech at the Foreign Ministry in June. They do not constitute preliminary conditions of any sort. They represent a demand to fulfill what everyone signed up to when adopting the Charter of the United Nations. So, we have it all set out in the strongest terms. And I have to say that, again, Americans, people who want to see a peace agreement reached in the conflict in Ukraine, need to take all of this seriously. As I said, on NATO, the issue of NATO, I simply cannot see the Russians walking back on what they've said about NATO. They might still be flexible on Ukraine's EU membership, though I'm starting to have doubts about that too. Notice that neither Putin nor Lavrov nor any other Russian official talk about that anymore, talk about Russia supporting Ukraine's application to join NATO, the EU. It may be that that's simply because they know that won't go down very well with Russian public opinion and they don't want to emphasize it for that reason. But it could also be that they've changed their stance on it, and whereas they were prepared to agree to it in Istanbul, they're not so keen on agreeing to it now. That's possible. Lavrov had some very critical things to say in this same interview about the Europeans, and Medvedev has made further comments about the Europeans, in which he talks about the fact that the Europeans should be punished, which doesn't seem to me like suggesting that he thinks that letting Ukraine enter the EU would be, from Russia's point of view, a good idea. But anyway, on the key issue of NATO membership, I think that the Russians are not going to shift their position. And on the 4 regions, even on the boundaries of the 4 regions, I'm coming increasingly round to the same view. There may be, as Matviyenko has said, scope for some discussion on the margins. But as far as the Russians are concerned, the position is what was agreed in Istanbul. So, there we are. These comments obviously have been made by Putin, Lavrov, and Matviyenko in light of the fact that Trump clearly is looking for some way to end the Ukraine war. They're making these public comments in light of the fact that they've been contacted by Orban and Fico, who are also communicating to the Russians the serious desire on the part of the Trump people to find a way out of this mess. But the Russians are making their position very, very clear. They're prepared to talk. They're prepared to sit down with Trump. Putin is prepared to meet Trump. He might be prepared to meet Trump in Bratislava, in Slovakia. Though how exactly he would get there, he would have to cross either EU territory, where of course there's an arrest warrant out for him, or he would have to cross Ukraine territory, which I can't for a moment even begin to imagine. But anyway, some kind of negotiations could take place, but the Russians have set out very clearly their terms. Now, Lavrov did make a number of further very interesting points over the course of this actually quite massive interview. One is that he exposed the extraordinary double dealing of Emmanuel Macron. And he made the point that Emmanuel Macron, even at the same time as he takes publicly the hardest possible line on Ukraine, he talks about sending French troops to Ukraine. He, at one and the same time, also talks about, he was also been in contact with the Russians, trying to set up some kind of private dialogue with the Russians about Ukraine, going against the stated Western policy, no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine. And Lavrov's words about Macron, or at least about the French generally, were pretty scathing. He said, our colleagues have a penchant, French colleagues have a penchant for playing a proactive role in addressing various issues. We welcome this enthusiasm, though I am uncertain about the outcomes of such initiatives and the sincerity of their intentions to play a constructive role. I will refrain from delving into specifics to avoid any indiscretions. On several occasions, through confidential channels, we have received messages from our French counterparts offering assistance in establishing a dialogue regarding the Ukrainian issue, excluding Ukraine itself. This approach contravenes the principle repeatedly emphasized by the West, not a word about Ukraine without Ukraine. We are open to communication. We are prepared to listen. However, simultaneously, France emerges as the principal advocate for deploying peacekeeping troops, and the Russian transcript of Lavrov's words, the official transcript, puts the word peacekeeping troops in quotation marks. To Ukraine, it trains combat units of the Ukrainian armed forces on its own soil. It explicitly states the necessity of continuing to pound Russia to ensure Ukraine enters into negotiations from a position of strength. Such contradictory behavior does not inspire confidence in the initiative of our French colleagues. Well, the irony here is not difficult to ignore. The sense of irony of Lavrov's part. He clearly doesn't think much about the French and about what Macron has been up to. By the way, I recall that about a year ago, the Russians, I think it was Putin on that occasion, disclosed the fact that they'd been receiving regular messages from a Western power seeking to establish some kind of private line of communication. I remember speculating at the time that that was probably France, and here we see Lavrov has just confirmed that it was. And at the same time, Lavrov also spoke, and this is perhaps another particularly important part of his press conference. He also spoke about the need to establish a new security structure in Europe, and my own clear understanding about these comments about establishing a security structure in Europe is that ultimately, if negotiations begin, if talks between the Americans and the Russians take place, it is in the direction of trying to agree a security structure for Europe, a renewed security structure for Europe, that the Russians will want to direct the talks. Anyway, we will see. We will see where all of this goes. But anyway, as I've said, the Russians making their position very clear in advance of the talks. Now, Lavrov and Putin had a lot to say about the Syrian situation, which is all very interesting, but I will touch on that in a different program. If I start dwelling on all of that, well, this program will turn out even longer than perhaps it should. So anyway, that's Lavrov, that's Putin, that's Matviyenko. Now, there have been some comments made by others about negotiations. There's been a long article by Samuel Charap of the Council of Foreign Relations, which has appeared in, I believe it was Foreign Affairs. And again, I owe it to Jeff Roberts, the historian, concerning this article. And Charup has been a voice of, well, I'd say reason in the United States on the whole question of the Ukraine war. Back in, I think it was late 2022, early 2023, he co-authored a long report for the RAND Corporation talking about how an extended war in Ukraine was not in US interests and casting doubt on whether Ukraine could win the war and basically urging peace talks. He's come back to that time and again in various discussions. And he's written a long-up piece in Foreign Affairs suggesting various things about how negotiations could be conducted. I have to say that there was an awful lot in this article with which I didn't agree. For example, he took the view that it was essential that negotiations should involve more parties than just the United States and Russia, that Ukraine and the Europeans ought also to be involved. I take the diametrically opposite view at this time. I think that if the Europeans and the Ukrainians are brought in at an early stage in this process, as Anatol Lieven was saying about the Ukrainians, and as I say about the Europeans, the process of the negotiations will be wrecked. It will go nowhere. We will end with no effective negotiations at all. The negotiations will very quickly indeed break down. Charup also seems to think that there were agreements almost reached between the Russians and the Ukrainians about ceasing attacks on each other's energy systems. This was an article appeared to this effect in the Financial Times. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians have said that that article was wrong. Not only was there no agreement or draft agreement, there were no discussions even on this topic. So I'm not sure where Charup is getting his information from, but I think he may think that there's been more understanding and convergence than there actually has been. But anyway, Charup does make one point, and it is a correct point, and it is the one which I think offers the best hope for a peaceful settlement going forward, which is basically that whereas the Biden administration, Biden himself, did not want to talk to the Russians, Trump does. Whereas Biden, after the start of the special military operation, never spoke with Putin, never called him, and in fact tried to enforce a boycott on speaking with Putin on the part of Western leaders, a boycott which is generally held. Trump understands the importance of talks and of diplomacy, and is now seeking a summit meeting with with Putin. And of course, beyond that, Trump has appointed a peace envoy, who is Kellogg. Now, Kellogg may have all sorts of ideas and views which are diametrically in conflict with Russian positions, but he will be meeting with the Russians. There will be discussions. Some kind of process will be underway. And unless there is dialogue, you're not going to get anywhere at all. And when dialogue does take place, over time, compromises and ways forward perhaps can be found. And incidentally, and on this issue, the New York Times has recently just published an article which strongly reinforces my own belief that many of these proposals for peacekeeping forces from Europe to be sent to Ukraine are just spoilers. This goes back to the point about it being important to keep the Europeans, for the moment, out of the negotiations. Given that Trump and the Americans soon will want them, whereas the dominant parties in Europe and, of course, Ukraine don't. But anyway, the New York Times article basically said that the whole topic of European peacekeeping troops being sent to Ukraine is something that simply will not fly. It has no reality to it. The Russians will never agree to it, point that Anatol Lieven has also made in a piece in Responsible Statecraft, and which I've also made too in several programs. And the European public won't accept it either, which is also a point I have made in several programs. So why bring up this bad idea at all? As I said, it's being floated in order to complicate Trump's attempts to conduct negotiations with the Russians, and in order to present the Russians with proposals which they're certain to reject and which will lead to the negotiations becoming stillborn. So Charup's proposals that the Europeans be involved and the Ukrainians be involved at the outset, in my opinion, certainly wrong, certainly mistaken. You would be bringing the wreckers into the midst of the process, putting them in a better position to wreck it before it even properly begins. And the whole point of appointing a peace envoy, of getting Kellogg there, is at least to get some kind of process of dialogue begun. And the priority, anyway, should be arranging a meeting between Putin and Trump as quickly as possible after Trump is inaugurated. Now, Lavrov, in his in his interview, by the way, has also confirmed that there are still no direct contacts between the Russians and Donald Trump and his team. So there we are. That's where we stand today. The Russians laying it out straight. This is their position. They've negotiated. They've wasted time with the Minsk agreement. They've wasted time with Istanbul. They were given all kinds of promises about NATO expansion. They've come up with all sorts of other agreements with the West. As far as they're concerned, none of these agreements were ever properly honoured. They're not prepared to go down that road again. They want a settlement, a permanent settlement of the conflict. And that has to be based on what they set out, what Putin set out in his speech to the foreign ministry. In other words, on Istanbul Plus. Now, here I'm going to say something else, which is that there will be a temptation, a very strong temptation, in the United States, among Trump's people, to come along to the Russians, have those meetings, have those discussions, listen to what the Russians say, and then take time over the negotiations, waiting to see perhaps whether the Russians might bend. I think this would be a very unwise thing to do, because, to repeat a point I made in many programs, what is driving the conflict in Ukraine, the whole settlement negotiation process, what is driving it is the military situation on the ground. And over the last 2 days, since I did my last program, that military situation has continued to evolve. Firstly, there was the massive missile strike on Ukraine on Christmas Day. 70 missiles, large numbers of Duranium drones. Mostly, it seems, it was the energy facilities across Ukraine that were targeted. The Ukrainians launched a fair number of anti-aircraft missiles, trying to shoot down a fair number of Russian missiles. The Russians are claiming that an F-16 fighter jet was shot down by the Russian military. They're saying that it was shot down even as it was trying to launch a missile targeting Russian positions in Zaporozhye region. The point is that the Russians now have general control over the situation in the skies over Ukraine. Ukraine's air defenses have become increasingly threadbare. If an F-16 really did take off, really did try and launch missiles, and there's been no confirmation about this from the Ukrainians, well, according to the Russians, it was shot down very quickly, and Ukraine has now lost at least 2 of its F-16s in the air. One probably as a result of pilot error. This latest example, if it really did happen, as a result of Russian military action. And from what I can tell, despite Ukrainian claims to have shot down large numbers of missiles, it looks as if all of the facilities, all of the energy facilities were struck, that there was enormous amount of damage, again, done to the Ukrainian energy system. The Ukrainian energy system is crumbling, and there are now regular blackouts across Ukraine. Ukrainian civilians often left for many hours without power. The general situation there is deteriorating, and there is no reason to think that these Russian strikes are going to cease. In the meantime, the Russian advance continues. Now, the most interesting thing is what the Ukrainians themselves are saying about the situation. And we read comments like this by Yuri Butusev, who is, in my opinion, one of Ukraine's most insightful reporters about the conflict. Obviously, he is a strong supporter of Ukraine, very strong critic of Russia. There's no doubt at all about his loyalty. But anyway, he says things like this: we have no strategy. We have no tactics. Our troops are where there are the most cries of help. Pokrovsk will fall tomorrow. We have lost all our defense lines, all the heights and approaches to the city, surrendered practically without a fight. Now the enemy is already on the streets of Pokrovsk, well 3 kilometers away, and everyone is writing on social networks that Pokrovsk will fall by the new year. And now our government has woken up. Oh, Pokrovsk is falling, everyone must go there. Now, Butusev is exaggerating. The Russians are not quite as close to capturing Pokrovsk as he is saying. There is still some way to go. Now, over the last couple of weeks, the Russians have been capturing a lot of the key villages around south of Pokrovsk. They've been broadening their front lines around Pokrovsk. And people like myself, they've been expecting from one day to the next a Russian assault on Pokrovsk. The Russians, however, as I've said many times, don't consult people like me, don't inform me in advance of what their movements are going to be. And it has been very interesting because just as in the late summer, when the Russians arrived in the Pokrovsk area, when they started to storm places like Grodivka and Novogrodivka, people like myself and many Western commentators assumed that this was intended to lead to an immediate attack on Pokrovsk. But instead, the Russians took a different direction. They started to move south. And they moved south towards Selidovo. There was a mighty battle for Selidovo, which was, however, eventually captured and is now firmly under Russian control. And at the same time, the Russians advanced northward and captured Ugledar from the south, and that now they have been conducting a major operation around Kurakhovo, and this is the biggest battle of all throughout the entire Ukrainian conflict up to now. And certainly the Russians remained active in the Pokrovsk area, but the major assault on Pokrovsk that pretty much every commentator expected, that the Westerners were talking about with each other, well, that failed to materialize because the Russians prioritized the taking of Selidovo and Kurakhovo and before long Velikaya Novosilka and those sort of places. And then as the battles for Selidovo and Kurakhovo and Ugledar were either won or were winding down, again, especially after the Russian capture of the villages of Shevchenko and Novotroitske close to Pokrovsk, again, it was assumed by many people, myself included, that a Russian attack on Pokrovsk was about to happen. Except, again, the Russians have not done what anyone expected. Instead of advancing directly to assault Pokrovsk, they have continued to advance westwards. And it has been very interesting to watch them do this. They have been advancing steadily westwards, south of Pokrovsk. They now seem to be pushing towards capturing villages like Pishanye, Kotlinye, ultimately Udachnie, Uspenivka, Novomikhailovo. They seem to be aiming to outflank Pokrovsk from the south and west. And the other thing they're doing is that they are coming ever closer to the boundary of Donetsk region and Dnipro region, and it looks as if fairly soon they will be crossing that boundary and they will be entering Dnipro region itself. I get the sense that what the Russians are doing is operating a very fluid strategy. They attack where the Ukrainians are weakest. So the Ukrainians have been concentrating such forces as they have in this area, very limited in number apparently, in Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians conducted a major assault on the Russian south of Pokrovsk using the 3rd Azov Brigade. Every day I'm getting more and more accounts about what a complete disaster that counterattack ordered by General Tarnavsky has turned out to be. Anyway, because the Ukrainians were expecting an attack on Pokrovsk, they concentrated on defending Pokrovsk. This has left all of these villages to the southwest of Pokrovsk inadequately protected. And the Russians seem to be storming through these villages. They're being captured one after the other, apparently almost without resistance. And one wonders exactly what it is that the Russians ultimately are planning to do. Are they planning to capture all these villages and then wheel northwards towards the roads and the railway lines, cutting off Pokrovsk from the west? Or will they continue their offensive westwards until eventually, perhaps, they arrive at the Dnieper itself? Well, I can't answer that question. All I would say is that Russian advance in this area is proving extremely fast, and as I said, is coming up against limited resistance. And as for Pokrovsk itself, well, the Ukrainians do have troops there. They are trying to hold positions there. But of course, if this advance continues much longer, further, if the Russians capture more of these villages, if they cut off the roads west of Pokrovsk, then Pokrovsk itself will quickly will become essentially another encircled town. Well, that's Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians still have them people in the thermal power station in Kurachovo. The Russians apparently are now gradually closing all the exit routes from Kurachovo, from the thermal power plant. They're now close, apparently, to the village of Dachnia, which, interestingly, they are attacking from the south rather than from the north. I'm not going to try and second-guess Russian plans, but anyway, that's what they're doing. And the Russians have now definitely cut the main road, the main western road that the Ukrainians were using to keep Velikaya Novosilka supplied. The Russians, there is now film which confirms that there are Russian soldiers located directly on this road. So, Velikaya Novosilka cut off from major resupply. There is still access to the town from through various country roads, probably earthen roads, to the northwest. There's said to be some fortified positions that their Ukrainian troops still have there. There's suggestions that the Russians might try and clear the Ukrainians from the fields northeast of Velikaya Novosilka, so that the small town can be completely surrounded and taken into a cauldron. I don't think that myself. I think much more likely, far more probable, the Russians are going to do the same thing that they did in Ugledar, with all the main supply roads cut off, with the entire area patrolled by their drones. They will launch direct attacks on Velikaya Novosilka, and that the village, or rather the town, will be stormed at some point within the next couple of days. That's my view, but then, as we've seen, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't always do the things I expect it to do. Anyway, in the meantime, fighting goes on in other places. Toretsk, latest reports say that the Russians have in the process of clearing the Toretsk coal mine. It's the last coal mine and slag heap in this area. This has been, as I said, a relatively quickly fought battle, given how heavily fortified we'd been led to think Toretsk was. There's been less news from Chasiv Yar over the last couple of days, but it seems that the Russians have again managed to enter Kupiansk. There is still fighting going on in the village of Terny on the Oskol River. The Russians have enlarged their bridgeheads in the western part of the Oskol River and the Zherebets River. And, well, there's been an absolutely awful article in the Washington Post about the gloom and pessimism amongst the Ukrainian soldiers. Their morale is declining all the time. They're complaining about the fact that there is no infantry left to hold positions or to capture them. And they're talking about a generally disastrous situation. And in Kursk region, the Russians continue their advance. The Ukrainians claimed that they captured their first North Korean soldier. They released what they said was a photograph of him. The Russian channels poo-pooed and ridiculed that claim. They said that this was a photograph made in February 2022 of a Russian soldier from one of the Asian areas of Russia. I'm not anyway able to say. And there are now reports or claims, apparently from Ukraine, that the North Korean soldier, or alleged North Korean soldier, has died of wounds, which of course makes it impossible to produce him. So one way or the other, I'm not going to waste more time on that. So anyway, there it is. This is the situation today. The military situation continues to deteriorate in Ukraine. It's doing so at an accelerating pace. The Russians are on the brink of reaching Dnipro region. It's said that they're only 8 kilometers away, and there seems to be no stopping them. Butysov talks about a disastrous situation in Pokrovsk. The Washington Post talks about Ukrainian soldiers, their morale being incredibly poor. Now, all of this brings me back to the topic of negotiations, because listening or reading the kind of things that people like Butysov, Bezuglaya, Arestovich, these sort of Ukrainian commentators are saying. Arestovich has said that if you have to pick between Zelensky and Putin, whom you should trust Putin over Zelensky. And he was Zelensky's former spin doctor. Anyway, when you listen to all of this, when you look at the situation on the front lines, when you read articles like the one that's just appeared in the Washington Post, the thing that really impresses me is that there is not that much time anymore. Putin was asked whether there would be victory in 2025, and, well, he didn't say that there wouldn't be. He thought his words suggested that he thinks that there might be. And, of course, in military terms, well, who knows exactly what that means. But if the front lines collapse in Ukraine, which they could at any point within the next few months, I remember reading a short time ago one Ukrainian commentator predicting a collapse in the spring. Maybe, let's say, over the next 6 months. If there is a military collapse in Ukraine, what happens then? Western peacekeepers, European peacekeepers, we can forget it. New York Times tells us as much. Zelensky, well, he might be removed or he might not. We don't know what the effect would be. One thing I'm going to say is this. If the Russians reach the Dnieper, it will be a crisis for Ukraine, perhaps a terminal one. But if they cross the Dnieper, if they start occupying or reoccupying, not just places like Kherson, but places like Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog and Nikolaev and Odessa, which they might do, there would be people in Russia who would want it. If they close in on Kiev itself, if the Russians occupy these places, well, in the context of a Ukrainian collapse, in the context of a Ukrainian government that is clearly falling apart, there might not be that much opposition, international opposition from the global south, where they might feel that the opportunity for a negotiation was thrown away and lost. And if the Russians take these places, I cannot imagine any situation where they will withdraw from them. There is no conceivable possibility that the Russians will retreat from Odessa if they ever reach it. Just to say. So, if people want to preserve Ukraine and want some kind of negotiation leading to some kind of stabilization of the situation in Europe, then the time window to do it is probably quite short before events on the ground intervene. Well, that's where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.